Just yesterday, Donald Trump ratcheted up the pressure on America's allies. Just remember this. These are allies in his quest to acquire Greenland from Denmark. In a post on his social media site, he threatened to use or misuse his favorite economic tool, tariffs. The post reads in part, quote, starting on February 1st, 2026, all of the above mentioned countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland, will be charged a 10% tariff on any and all goods sent to the United States of America. On June 1st, 2026, the tariff will be increased to 25%. This tariff will be due and payable until such time as a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. As you might expect, our NATO allies were outraged. Here's the Swedish Prime Minister's translated response. He wrote in part, quote, we will not allow ourselves to be blackmailed. Only Denmark and Greenland decide on issues concerning Denmark and Greenland. Part of French President Emmanuel Macron's response reads, quote, no intimidation or threat will influence us, neither in Ukraine nor in Greenland nor anywhere else in the world when we are confronted with such situations. Tariff threats are unacceptable and have no place in this context, end quote. Democrats here at home are universally against the idea, not the tariffs, just the idea of taking Greenland. But there's some Republican pushback at home, too. Joining me now are two economic experts, Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, author and distinguished scholar at CUNY Graduate Center, and Justin Wolfers, economic professor at University of Michigan, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and co-author of Principles of Economics. Both are regular guests on this show. I don't often have to bring two esteemed economists on, but this is so big that I kind of need to. I need the horsepower. So I'm going to start with you, Paul. What's going on here? We've often thought Donald Trump's used the tariff thing incorrectly in the last year. So this is a unique and novel use of it. Also incorrect.
Well, first of all, it's blatantly illegal. You know, Trump, the president has certain ability to set tariffs, but basically it requires an economic emergency. And using tariffs to blackmail countries into handing over territory is definitely, the Supreme Court has been absent here, but it's clearly an illegal thing from U.S. law. And on top of that, even if he can do it, which he probably can't, it's crazy. I mean, we do not have that kind of leverage over Europe. The United States sells about as much to Europe as Europe sells to us. U.S. corporations have $4 trillion invested in Europe. The idea that we can blackmail a continent that has more people than we do, that has an economy that's almost as big as ours, that we can use these. I like to say that Trump thinks that tariffs are Vegematic. They do everything. They can slice, they can dice, they can balance the budget, they can reindustrialize, and they can be used to bully the whole world into submission, and they can't.
So, Justin, and this is where you, being a non-American born guy, might be helpful. You could look at all the things in the North and say, China and Russia are very active in the North and in the Arctic, and we have to deal with the fact that we've got adversaries out there. We actually, if you look at the Arctic, we have more allies than adversaries. But using Donald Trump's logic that we must have Greenland because the Chinese and the Russians are up there, then we must have Canada too, and probably Finland and all sorts of other. It's not really a logical way to think about this.
The number of errors here is enormous. So Paul started by pointing out it's illegal. You could go back one level and say, why the heck do we want Greenland? We can already have US bases there. And then you could say, well, even if the president were right and we needed Greenland, what should we do next? Well, if you create trade deals with countries 6 months ago, as the president claimed to have done with the European Union and the UK, and then wake up 6 months later and nothing has changed in the world, but you suddenly renege on them, then you've created an incentive for each of those countries to understand that you're never living up to your word, in which case there's no such thing as a deal. If there's no such thing as a deal, then there is no leverage. So, these countries could roll over tomorrow and say, oh, fine, we're going to help you take over Greenland and you're going to promise peace, but they understand they're not going to get peace back in return. So it doesn't even work on its own face. And there's one more problem, which is actually the president is using a tariff power the Supreme Court's about to rule on. This is a bit like walking into a bank with a gun and saying, your money or your life. Now, there's a 2/3 chance there's a blank in there, and we both understand before anything else happens, someone's going to come and inspect and find out whether it's a blank. Are you going to shovel the money across, or are you going to wait until we find out whether the gun's actually loaded with real ammunition? So no one's going to respond to this. So it doesn't even work on its own terms.
So let's talk about the Supreme Court case that'll ultimately, or not ultimately, but it'll sort of decide, Paul, whether Donald Trump can legally use his emergency, this argument that he uses that this is all an emergency. In fact, I remind people that that was the basis for imposing certain tariffs on Canada, that it was an emergency thing because of all the fentanyl that comes from Canada into the United States, which is kind of like all the fentanyl that was apparently coming in from Venezuela to the United States. His people, Kevin Hassett, the White House National Economic Council director, said on Fox on Friday that he believed that the court would side with the administration. So I want to get your view on that. But he also said we have a backup plan that's really solid. We can put a 10% tariff on right away to make up most of the room and then use things like these other authorities to achieve the goal. So can you just evaluate a little of this for me?
Yeah, I mean, there's a question of fine print in the laws. There's a bunch of laws that give presidents of the United States a fair bit of discretion on imposing temporary tariffs, but for specified reasons. And it's basically most of what Trump has done is under IEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, which is an old piece of legislation that was designed for, like the world is falling apart. And Trump is just calling everything an emergency. And it's not there. You can't simultaneously say that we have the hottest economy in history and we have an economic emergency that justifies tariffs. I have no idea about the Supreme Court. I mean, they've been so awful on these things. They're probably, I think we've been expecting a ruling from them for quite a while now. And I think they're just boggled because they don't want to go against Trump, but they also don't want to look like fools. So what they'll do is anybody's guess. But this is all completely crazy. And it's maybe they can find and pull another rabbit out of the hat and keep on with these tariffs, but it's all. I think the main point is what you're saying, that what Justin was saying, that the United States has now made it completely clear that America's word is worth nothing, that our promises are worth nothing, that if you have a solemn agreement with Trump, it lasts until he feels like doing something different. So that in itself tremendously reduces our bargaining power. We are just basically not a reliable partner in anything. And that's a huge loss. That goes over and above the economic cost of the tariffs. That's basically America is now a completely, we're worthless. There's no point in making friends with America because that lasts until Trump doesn't like something he had for breakfast.
Justin, I want to ask you about this whole Fed chair, Jerome Powell thing that's been developing. Jerome Powell is going to, at some point, cease to be the Fed chair. He is, I remind people, the Fed chair because Donald Trump made him the Fed chair. Although Donald Trump will tell you every time you ask him that Joe Biden made him the Fed chair. That's just not true. But that said, they've really escalated this. There's now an investigation into the Fed having to do with the renovation. I will say that international bond markets don't seem to be responding to this too much because people think it's as ridiculous as it might be. But it is a little bit weird and uncomfortable.
Yeah, this is
real. I'll start with Justin, then we'll go to Paul.
Yeah,
I think this is actually a really, really big deal. Undermine the independence of the Fed. The president's been at it for a while, doing it in this way, literally threatening to jail the Fed chair. That's something we've seen before. We've seen it in Venezuela. We've seen it in Zimbabwe. We've seen it in Russia. We've seen it in Turkey. We've seen it in Argentina. This is not the club of countries that you want to join. This is not an approach you want to see. What we haven't seen is markets freak out, and that's for a very important reason. So what we saw was Trump absolutely went full on to try and undermine the Fed in the most grotesque way possible. But Jay Powell went to the American people and he won. The scoreboard at the end of this thing is Jay Powell and Fed independence 1, Trump 0. So that's the reason markets didn't tank. They didn't tank because the president lost this round.
Go ahead, Paul. I was going to add something, Paul, that you're actually a real Nobel Prize winner on the show, and Donald Trump got took someone else's this week.
Maybe I should sell it to Donald Trump. But anyway, I gotta say that this is bigger than, it's not just that that Trump went after Powell, and Powell is uniquely well placed to defend himself. But there's lots of other people in official roles that we count upon to do their jobs, not to be pawns of the president. Trump fired the commissioner of labor statistics because he didn't like a job number. And now it turns out that the replacement is also professional, but that's also incredible. And then the idea that a government or quasi-government official, in the case of the Fed, doing what Congress mandates that they do is going to be subject to criminal charges for not being an abjectly obedient to the president of the United States. That's a much bigger thing than just the Fed. I mean, I think that economists sometimes lose people by going on about Fed independence, which is important, but there's lots of places where we count upon people to do their jobs, to be technocratic. We don't want the weather forecast to be what Donald Trump wants it to be. And
Correct.
We don't want Donald Trump's Sharpie to be determining what the weather forecast is. And so we simply just, this is a tremendously ominous development. The bond market may not be riled by this, but we, as American citizens,
no, I think your analysis of weather is totally right. Like, some things we just want people to look at the numbers and come to the conclusions that they come to on their own. Hey, but Justin, real quick, what do you make of the president's proposal to cap interest rates on credit cards at 10% for a year? On the surface, feels good. I mean, some people are paying 22, 23% on their credit cards.
I think there's actually a really deep lesson here, and it's less about economics and more about the media. You're asking me about something that the president just said, and this man just yaps, and as a result, you and I have to yap, and talk about this idea. He's never going to implement it. He said it'll be in by January 20th. Right now, it's the 18th. He doesn't have the power, he doesn't have the authority, and it's not going to happen. We're getting distracted by talking about what he wants us to talk about. We should talk instead about what he's doing, and this is the point Paul was just making. He's destroying American institutions. He's destroying the foundations of American prosperity. And every time we get distracted by what he talks about rather than what he does is he destroys and he redistributes to the rich. And that's really where we should continue to focus our attention.
Guys, thanks to both of you for a great conversation. Paul Krugman is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. I guess we have to start saying he earned his Nobel Prize. Somebody else didn't just give it to him. He's the author of many books, including The Return of Depression Economics. Justin Wolfers is an economics professor at the University of Michigan and co-author of The Principles of Economics.